Hello, and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 2030. The topic is Q&A, and the title is Setting Up Meredith's 2024 Contest Prep Diet. So, Meredith, if you are not familiar yet, she is going to be competing in a show this year. We're about 24 weeks away. Two podcasts ago, so podcast 2028, Meredith and I discussed the start of it and why she's doing it, some obstacles we think might come up, how we're going to work through those. And it was a good kind of starting discussion. And I wanted to follow up with today's podcast because I actually got a really good follow-up question from one of my clients. So I have a business client service where it's typically personal trainers. They're wanting to improve their quality of their services and or add new services. They're talking about just developing business. So that's why it's a business client. So this client, they're a personal trainer and they're wanting to learn how to do nutrition coaching for their clients. And they want to do it in a way that is most effective, but also doesn't require, I'm trying to think how to word this is, word it properly to where it sounds correct, is it doesn't require a lot of time for the trainer to do, but it's the minimum of amount of time in the most maximum impactful way. Not sure how to word that because I don't want it to seem like the trainer doesn't want to do the work, but they don't want to do unnecessary work. They have been following the podcast for a while. I don't know exactly how long, probably a year or more. And they really liked the way in which I taught nutrition. So they wanted to learn how to do that, but apply it to their clients, not just themselves. So we're going through that. Recently, they asked a question just this week in our weekly Zoom meeting. They said, how did you set up Meredith's contest prep diet? I know the typical prep foods like egg whites and oats and whitefish, etc. But in the podcast you and Meredith did recently, she mentioned she's eating bagels for breakfast and pasta for lunch and rice for dinner. I'm curious what foods you use for contest preps and how you set up the diets for your clients. Awesome. Love the question. Great question. So the foods that I use to prep are different for each client. Essentially what I'm looking to do is I want to use the foods that they already eat and their current schedule that they already follow. Now, I might have to make some changes. Absolutely. Sometimes happens. But in a lot of the cases, we can actually use the foods they already eat, the schedule they already have, and maybe just tweak a little bit of the portions, get things to be more consistent. What we're really looking for is a diet that we can start with that they can be maximally adherent and consistent with, so we can then start to make predictable changes to that diet and get a predictable outcome in regards to getting them leaner and leaner and leaner for a competition. So the idea of starting with foods they already eat and the schedule they already follow is that's going to help increase their adherence. One of the worst things you could do as a trainer is to give somebody a brand new set of foods, brand new time schedule, and then say, okay, go. You have to be perfect from here on out. And it's like, holy freaking crap. They have to change so much about their life when you change the foods and or the schedule that there's definitely going to be a time frame in which they would need to do that. But that's also a lot of stress. I don't want to have that stress on my clients. I want them to keep stress levels as low, make this as easy as possible. We want to get maximum results. I've helped people get pro cards in both drug tested and non-tested federations. So I have, helped people to the top of what that is. But we want to do it in the least stressfully impactful way. And one of the ways you can reduce stress is to use foods they already eat in the schedule they already follow. Now, how we would set this up, how I set up for Meredith is how I'd set up for anybody. So I'm going to talk about Meredith as the specific example. However, the concepts would apply to anyone. So the first thing is I figure out what and when do they already eat. So what are they already eating? When do they already eat it? That's going to be the first step. And then once I have all that written down, figured out, organized, and typically for most people, I don't know, it's actually a hit or miss in the sense of Some of the clients that come to me, they're already personal trainers. They want to advance their career, so they're already eating ridiculously consistent. So there's not much to have to kind of modify and play with there. It's already pretty consistent. However, if somebody's inconsistent, I would want to know their typical food choices, even if they don't really know. And I mean that is I'll say, well, what do you normally have for lunch? Well, I don't really know. It changes. And I'm like, okay, that is totally fine. And because it's, if that's true, that's true. But I also need to know, what does it change from? Like, what are the specifics? So they'll say sometimes they eat at a restaurant near work. Sometimes they skip lunch. Sometimes they eat some crappy cafeteria thing at the basement of their building. Sometimes they'll take food from from home the night before. If it's truly random, I still want to know what the items are. Because if there is a food court at the bottom of their building, we'd be like, ooh, okay, well, let's explore the options, because that's going to be able to be very consistent. It's also a really good backup option. So maybe we end up planning on having them bring something from home, but what happens if they don't? Knowing what's available to them, knowing what they normally do. If the client normally eats out at a restaurant, that's fine. Let me look at the menu on the restaurant. Let's see what has the right amount of protein, the right amount of carbs and fats with it. How do we get the right meal out of what's available to us? And that's the benefit of learning what and when do they already eat. Then, once you know that, you want to figure out, okay, is there enough protein throughout the day? That's the first level of protein is, are we having enough protein? Typically, if we're getting ready for a competition, we want them to be around 1 gram per pound of body weight. That's going to vary depending on the person. Sometimes it can be more than that. But we're looking for around 1 gram per pound of body weight. So how are they doing that on a daily basis, like a 24-hour basis? And then we would look at, okay, for each individual kind of meal of the day, or you think of it as like time sections of the day, you want them to have a pretty well-balanced protein intake. What I'll typically do is to take the time of the day that they're awake. So we typically sleep 6 to 8 hours. That's going to be, then we're awake for 16 to 18 hours. If I take the 18, because that's usually more common, and I divide it into 3 sections, it's basically the first 6 hours of being awake, the middle 6 hours of being awake, and the final 6 hours of being awake. I want to make sure that there's a pretty decent, even distribution of protein across those 3 blocks. So that way they're not starting their day with predominantly a carb-based breakfast, maybe 12 grams of protein, then that's supposed to last them for 6 hours. That's not gonna optimize protein synthesis, muscle repair, positive adaptations from the day before in training. So we want to make sure there's sufficient protein during each time block of the day, because there's a demand of the body for protein at all times of the day. So that would be the second stage. So first stage is what and when do they already eat. Figure that out, list it out, know the options you're working with food-wise. Then we want to ask, is there enough protein during the day? And then, even deeper, is there enough protein balanced throughout the day? Then the third question is, does the digestion rates of the foods match the time between the meals? What this means is, I had a client recently, they were having a Yoplait yogurt thing that was, I think, maybe 10 grams of protein. And they were having that with fruit at, I think, 6:30 in the morning. And then they weren't eating till lunch. There is no way in hell that the energy of the fruit and the protein from that yogurt is going to last 6 hours. It's just not. The body would have processed it, let it into the bloodstream. The body would have then picked off the protein, used it, burned off whatever energy was coming from the fruit and the yogurt, and then it's going to sit around for a while in a deficit. Do we want some degree of deficit in order to promote fat loss? Sure, absolutely we do. But we want a severity of deficit that is kind of controlled and minimized throughout the day. And what I mean by that is we don't want long sections of the day where we have an enormous deficit. Because then when you eat, you have a momentary surplus. We don't want the body to try to save anything in that momentary surplus. We don't want the body following the bouts of time where it's severely underfed, thinking that it would be beneficial to reduce caloric usage during the day. So we'll refer to that commonly as like somebody's metabolism is slowing down. What that means is basically their body's allocating less energy use to non-essential processes. A good example, just growing your hair, your skin, your nails. So you'll find somebody, if they're in a too severe of a caloric deficit, their hair starts to feel thinner. Their skin is a little drier and like scaly. It has a little bit of like an eczema type like feel to it. And their nails don't grow as much as at all. What's interesting is for me, I have my hair cut very short. Basically, I just use a set of clippers that my wife got me for, I think it was a Christmas gift a couple years ago. And I just buzz it short. And I do that typically once a week. When I am pushing my protein and I'm training often and I really have everything set in place to push muscle growth, I'll notice that my hair actually starts to get thick. And where I would typically cut it every 7 days, I'm now having to cut it every 4 or 5 days. So that's actually an indicator for me of how well I'm doing with protein intake. Anytime we travel or if something happens and I don't get my typical protein intake, I'll notice all of a sudden I didn't have to cut my hair until the 6th or 7th day. Then I'm like, oh no, that means I gotta get back on track. Now I track my food every day, so I'm already well aware of that. But that is an indicator that would just be a neat thing, is that I can see the caloric expenditure my body allocates towards growing my hair, and I can see how that would change given the available calories or the available protein. And then that helps me determine my diet. It's just neat to know that that actually is impactful, that you can see it and there's an impact in that realm in regards to like growing your hair, your skin, and your nails. So we want to make sure that the food digests about the time we need to eat our next meal. What we're looking for when we're trying to create a caloric deficit that promotes fat loss is there is a window of deficit that our body typically responds best to in regards to enough of a deficit to promote fat loss, but not so severe of a deficit the body starts to actually fight against that process. How we would know where that is roughly around 80% of your total calorie demand for the day. You would eat around 80 to 90% of that. Now, the percentages are going to vary a little bit. There'll, I'm sure, be different opinions and blah, blah, blah. But the concept is that if we look at our caloric usage, the biggest contributor to calorie usage is what's called your BMR, your basal metabolic rate, or resting metabolic rate, RMR. It's just how many calories you burn by simply being alive. So if you were to lay in bed, eyes closed, but you're alive, your body is burning, if we look at percentages of our typical daily use, around 70-ish%. So 60, 70% of our calories that we burn every day is simply because we're alive. If we start to eat below that number, the body does start to adjust in a negative way in regards to the goal of fat loss. It adjusts in a negative way by reducing caloric usage, by trying to start to store new fats anytime there's momentary surpluses when we eat food. It fights against fat being burned off when there's not enough food. It really starts to fight the process. And that's when people often will start a diet. They'll start with a severe caloric reduction. They get initial couple weeks of benefit of weight reduction, and then things seem to plateau. One of the contributors to it plateauing would be is if they are eating below their RMR, their body's going to start to fight against that. So we want to be above the BMR. Above the BMR, we start getting into the calories that we burn to just digest the food that we eat, the calories we burn to be up and active and moving, and then exercise-based calories. Ideally, we would like to have enough of a deficit that we're seeing fat loss happen. And we're seeing it in the photos that we take. We're seeing it in physical check-ins, if you do check-ins with your clients. We're seeing it in weight being lost on a scale. So we want to be able to see that there is weight, like body fat, basically coming off. So we want to be in a caloric deficit that promotes that, but not in a caloric deficit that is under our BMR. And that's going to be a good way to kind of set up our overall diet. So what I do then is I'm going to write out the meals and figure out the macros for each individual meal. I really like this because it gets you an overall picture of the day. So what Meredith's diet currently looks like is her breakfast. We're going to classify that as one meal of the day. We have daily snacks as another kind of quote unquote meal of the day. She does eat that kind of throughout the day, but that we're just going to call that one unit of food that we are going to be manipulating over time. And then we have lunch, then we have dinner. So those are her four kind of meal windows, groupings that I would look at that I want to modify and adjust over time. So breakfast is a bagel sandwich. It's a Canyon gluten-free bagel. And she then puts on a little bit of butter, a little bit of sugar-free jelly. She slaps on an egg that she just microwaves. I think we microwave it for, oh my gosh, I do this every single day and I can't remember now. I think it's 35 seconds. That's hysterical because I do it every day. It's just so automated that I don't remember anymore. But yeah, so the bagel's frozen. We will take it out of the freezer, microwave that for 40 seconds, slice it in half, throw it in the toaster. Then you take a bowl, you spray it with a little bit of like, olive oil spray, and crack an egg in there, microwave that for 35 seconds. When the bagel's done toasting, slap on a little bit of butter, a little bit of sugar-free jelly. Then you slide the egg on there and then hand it to her and she eats it. We also have a core power drink, which would be, it's like chocolate milk, but it's a protein-based drink. So she'll have the bagel sandwich and the core power. And that adds up to 520 calories with 36 grams of protein. And that means that the protein contribution to the total meal is 27%. And I'm going to come back on why that's important here in a second. Our daily snacks, she has 3 cheese sticks. And she has this bobo thing, which is like an oats, kind of like think of like an oat bar, but it's like, it looks like a muffin, and inside of it is like a jelly. She has this apple one that she really likes, but there's also a strawberry one that we get when the apple one's out. So she'll have the cheese sticks and the bobo. That's 410 calories, 23 grams of protein, and that's 22% protein contribution. Then we have lunch. We have banza pasta, which is a chickpea pasta. She has half the box, which is 4 ounces of dry weight. And then she'll put on that garlic expressions, which is this oil type dressing. It's canola oil, but she'll put on 2 tablespoons of that. It ends up being 500 calories, 22 grams of protein, so a 17% protein contribution. Then for dinner, we have chicken and rice. It's just jasmine rice, microwavable pouch, make it quick and easy. The chicken, I have it weighed out. I think it's 6 ounces now. And then she has it's an oil type dressing, but it's that shrimp sauce type dressing. So she'll have that. That's 970 calories with 50 grams of protein, and that's a 20% protein contribution. So in total, we're looking at 2,400 calories during the day, 130 grams of protein, and that gives a 21% of protein contribution. Now, what I want to do is have her follow those specific foods as consistently as possible, but by writing down the macros for each meal, that we're writing down the calories and the protein. That is what we're looking for is, okay, if she doesn't want to have the bagel one morning, or we get we're early, we have to go to a doctor's appointment, things are kind of, schedules change, therefore maybe food selection has to change, we would still aim for around 520 calories and 36 grams of protein. So we know the macros, so that way if we do have to change the foods, we want to make sure that we're as consistent as possible to the macros. We don't need to be consistent to the food. We need to be consistent to the macros. And it just so happens that if you eat the same damn foods, that works pretty well to be consistent towards your macros. So that is why we eat the same foods commonly. However, she can substitute them. The more you substitute, it does cause other issues to where maybe you're changing the fat and carb percentage in the meal. That can change how full you feel from that meal, which then can cause you to feel hungrier earlier or not as hungry for the next meal. You also would introduce different food to your digestive tract, and then your digestive bacteria has to modify and adjust for that. The more inconsistent you are with foods, the more random foods you have, typically you're going to have, there's a pro and a con. is if you eat the same foods all the time, that can actually be detrimental to digestion because the body starts to actually can develop kind of like an allergic effect or an inflammation type effect, especially to proteins. They've shown that, and I've actually seen that in clients where if they don't eat enough variety of proteins, they start to get bloated and watery after their meals, and we start to figure out, hey, what's going on? We had to switch some foods around, and all of a sudden that goes away. So some variety is good, but if you're changing your foods all the time, every day, that's going to be detrimental. So for Meredith, she has enough varieties that she has a bagel, core power drink, cheese sticks, this oat bobo thing, chickpeas in her pasta, this different type of dressing, chicken, rice, another different type of dressing, which is a different type of fats. So there's a lot of variety there. Now, if you look at this, you could say easily we're not eating a lot of vegetables, and that's okay. For now, she takes a multivitamin. She has digestive enzymes and probiotics and whatnot she takes. Her blood work is great. We get her blood work done every 6 months. She's fine. She's not deficient in anything. So what we would look for, like she takes Metamucil in the morning, which helps with fiber to make sure that she goes to the bathroom on a regular basis and is getting that cleared out, so she doesn't have a backup in her system, feel bloated, feel uncomfortable, and then not want to eat. So we do want to have regular digestion, regular bowel movements. So you can do Metamucil for that. You could do a certain amount of fiber in your diet, and that works well. So for her, we found that these foods work well. Now, as we need to reduce calories, if all of a sudden the meal starts to feel like not a lot of volume, then we would add vegetables to increase the volume to the meal. But a lot of vegetables don't really add a lot of caloric content to the meal. So she can still maintain a high volume of meal to feel full, but we're going to be able to reduce the calories as we would need. So over time, if we're looking at, the chicken and rice meal at night, we might substitute half the rice for peas or green beans or asparagus to where she still feels like she's eating a typical amount, but the calorie count is definitely lower. So that's what we're going to look for over time, is you can use food substitutions to maintain the same volume but reduce the calories, and that doesn't make the person feel as though they're eating as low of calories as they typically are because they're eating a normal amount of food. One of the ways in which our body regulates feeling full is the amount of stretch the food volume creates on the stomach lining. So we want to maintain the same volume, which would maintain the same pressure and stretch pressure, basically stretch tension in the gut, in the stomach, whenever she eats, and therefore she's going to feel like she's eating just as much, even if the calories are lower. Now she's going to feel that in her energy and stuff, but that's one of the tricks you can use to manage lower calorie meals and not feel so hungry, is to increase the volume, which you can do through food substitutions. So that's essentially what we're looking for. Is I know what and when she already eats. And then is there enough protein in the day? And then is it well balanced throughout the day? Do the digestion rates of the foods match the time between the meals? What would be an example of that, like I said, was the client who did the fruit and yogurt, but then waited 6 hours. They were super starving, super hungry. They ended up overeating in the afternoon or feeling super tired. We modified that breakfast, got a better digestion rate, got rid of the afternoon energy slump, and got rid of the afternoon kind of snacky type cravings. So that's what you're looking to do, is just, can I eat enough at this meal to where I feel like I'm ready for my next meal? So maybe I'm just making things simple. Say you eat at 6 a.m. and noon. You want to eat enough at 6 a.m. that around 11, maybe 11:30, you're starting to go, I'm getting kind of hungry. I wonder what time it is. And then you're like, oh, okay, it's almost time to eat. That's a pretty good sequence that you're looking for, is when your body can start to predict when the next meal time is. That's a good place to be in for healthy fat loss. If it's predicting that meal time, but it's only 9:30, and now all of a sudden you're starving, you're hungry, you're having to find activities to keep your brain busy, and it's starting to create this stressed environment, that's too hungry too soon. Then what we want to do is, as we progress, we'll keep the protein around 1 gram per pound of body weight. We want to create increasing caloric deficit to continue to promote fat loss by, number one, increasing our weight training volume. Then number two, whenever we've maxed out our weight training volume, we want to increase non-damage movement volume, which would be like step count for the day or doing like low intensity cardio. And then number three, we would actually look to reduce our carbs and fats. But we want to reduce our food intake as the last option. You want to increase your energy output first. That helps promote the person to be leaner, push the metabolism to remain high. It really helps the system and process of fat loss stay at an optimal rate. Once you start reducing carbs and fats, you start reducing calories, you do start to run into the risk of now we're getting closer and closer to BMR, and we actually might drop under the BMR, and then the body starts fighting that process. So you want to avoid the body fighting the process for as long as possible. One of the ways to do that is to increase energy expenditure rather than decreasing energy intake. Awesome. We're going to track her body weight, take photos, we discuss her hunger and energy levels along the way, and then just make some adjustments. But we're really looking for the body weight to come down, looking for the improvement in the aesthetics in the photos. And as long as that is happening at a rate in which we believe will get her ready in 24 weeks, then we're doing great. If we need to speed that up at any point, we just increase the volume of energy output, decrease the carbs and fats, let the body kind of deal with that annoyance. It'll drop some more body fat, and then we're going to get a little bit of a faster response if we need. So over time, we're going to do that. We're going to push movement volume, but when I make adjustments to meals, I'll be reducing carbs and fats. And specifically, I'm going to look to do that to where the meals that have the lowest protein percentage, I'm going to look to reduce the carbs and fats from those meals first. So for example, her breakfast is a 27% protein contribution, but her lunch is only 17%. Right now, that's okay because she's active during the day. She's a standing desk. She has a lot of things going on mentally at work. We want to make sure we keep our energy levels high. However, if it does come down to where, okay, we do need to start getting leaner, if one of the meals is 17% and the other one's 27%, I'm going to probably look to reduce the carb and fat intake of the 17% protein intake meal because that means that there's more margin for carb and fat intake to be reduced with less energy impact. Once a meal is at 33% protein contribution or higher, you're not going to feel a lot of energy from that meal. So you want to avoid having any of the meals over a 33% protein intake before all of the meals are there, and then we're forced to do that because there's no other option. All the meals are at that place. So eventually what you're looking to do is to increase the protein percentage per meal up to about 33%. And then when you're at that stage, you got to start cutting carbs and fats if you need more fat loss. And typically I'll do that before they go to bed. So that way if they're hungry, they're going to bed before they realize they're hungry. And they wake up starved, but that pushes the process of fat loss. And at least they're not awake for a time period in which they would typically feel that hunger. Okay, so that is how I set up Meredith's diet. And that's how I would set up anybody's diet, is to, if we're getting ready for a contest prep diet, we want to set it up by learning what and when does the person already eat, finding out if there's enough protein during the day, like per 24 hours, and then is there enough protein spread throughout the day? Does the digestion rates of the foods match the time between the meals? Then we want to write everything out, figure out the protein percentage per meal. I want to keep protein at 1 gram per pound of body weight. We want to create an increasing caloric deficit to promote continued fat loss by first increasing training volume, weight training volume. Second, increase non-weight training movement volume, which would be like step count. Third, then you do actually want to reduce carbs and fats, but we reduce them to where each meal has a nice even percentage of protein percent contribution up to about 33%. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful enough to get us all started and answer that client's question. And then as Meredith and I progress through her prep, I'll come back and talk about the adjustments that we're making over time, why we make those adjustments, and that can kind of teach how you would make adjustments as you go through the process. So check in with the podcast to learn how the process is going. And then also we're going to be starting to film some of her workouts, which we'll be sharing on our YouTube channel. So you can find us on YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym, subscribe so that you get notified when there's new videos, and you can see the way in which I'm training her to match this type of nutritional approach. Awesome. If you have any questions, if you need anything, you can reach out on the website, www.brutalirongym.com. On the bottom of that homepage is a contact form. Above that's the podcast player. You can find older podcasts. We also have the list of our services and then free information for training and nutrition on the website as well. So there's a lot on the website. So that's why I'm promoting people go there to shoot me a message so you can see what else is on the website. Then if you like the podcast, please share the podcast. The more people we share it with, the more people it can help. If you like the podcast, please consider donating to support the podcast, which you can do on our website to help cover some of the hosting costs and the time spent doing it. And then if you like the information we share in the podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels. You can find us and follow us on Instagram and YouTube under the name Brutal Iron Gym. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.